So, Souls-likes. Quite possibly my least favorite genre name out of pretty much all of them, really. Don't get me wrong, I love the Souls-like genre itself. I play tons of FromSoft games, like Elden Ring and Nightreign, of course, and hell, I just downloaded Lies of P to try that out later with the new DLC, but the Souls-like genre itself is just so poorly defined, really. It's just kind of something that most people seem to identify based on vibes, if anything. And like you look at a game and you go, yeah, of course that's a Souls-like. That's a Souls-like, and this is a Souls-like, right? And I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before, but out of all the genres named after specific games, Souls-like really is the least well-defined out of all of them. Like, Metroidvanias are games with big explorable worlds where you gain new abilities over time that can also be used in the environment to access new areas. Roguelikes, meanwhile, tend to be about short runs along randomized levels with rapid progression, but your progress gets reset at the end of each run. But by comparison, Souls-likes just don't really have as clear of a definition. Like, you can describe a Souls game easily enough. Most of them have slower paced combat. They tend to be pretty difficult. But honestly, a lot of these qualifiers are kind of subjective. Like, what is hard combat for one person can be trivial for another. Same with combat speed. So, like, we really need to focus on the specific mechanics that define a genre, not the more descriptive qualifiers. And weirdly enough, there's not really a lot about the combat itself that I think can necessarily define a game as being a Souls-like. Some games that I think are pretty definitively considered Souls-likes focus more on things like defense and parrying, while other Souls-likes focus on offense and retaliation. Some focus on stamina management, while others don't even have a stamina meter at all. Some people even consider 2D games like Hollow Knight to be Souls-likes. The only thing that I can think of that unites these disparate games is that, well, they all have a generally good action combat system. So, like, looking beyond the combat itself, there's at least a few other factors that I see commonly associated with Souls-likes, but I'm only really convinced by a handful of them. Some people will mention more intangible things, like the atmosphere or the indirect storytelling, as key features of a Souls-like game, but again, these are aspects of a game that are kind of hard to concretely define. Plus, I mean, if they took a game like Dark Souls itself and were more explicit with the storytelling, would that really suddenly disqualify it from being considered a Souls-like? And I think it's kind of pointless to limit the genre to this sort of dark fantasy atmosphere and aesthetic. Like, Another Crab's Treasure is considered a pretty great Souls-like, but should it really be disqualified simply because it has a really bright and colorful, like, color scheme with a more cartoony art style? At the end of the day, probably the most iconic mechanics for the Souls-like genre are the bonfire system and corpse running. The bonfire is, of course, essentially a checkpoint system. Every time you reach a bonfire, that player is effectively, well, safe. They've effectively hit a safe zone where they can take a moment to replenish all their resources and spend those resources to level up and whatnot. But it also notably respawns pretty much all of the enemies in the area apart from bosses. So you can't just clear out an area, then go back to a bonfire to stock up again before moving on. You have to press on through in whatever state you're in, and I think that that is a core element of the bonfire system that separates it out from a simple checkpoint. And then, of course, there's corpse running, which I don't think the Souls games invented by any means, but they did at least popularize it as a mechanic. The basic idea is that any resources that you haven't spent are still kind of being held on your person, so when you are killed, you drop those resources where you died, and now on your next life, you have to make it back to where you died in order to get them back. And if you die again before doing so, well, then those resources are simply lost forever. Now, these are pretty defining features of the Souls-like games, of course, but one mechanic does not make a genre. After all, if corpse running alone was enough to define a Souls-like, then that would mean that games like Shovel Knight, for example, are Souls games simply for having corpse running. And I think that the same is true of like bonfires. I mean, plenty of games have checkpoints of some variety after all, so I think it's really the combination of these sorts of factors. Safe zone bonfires that replenish your resources, and corpse running that kind of give a game the Souls vibe, so to speak. Now, if you can think of any other good specific qualifiers for the Souls-like genre, feel free to let me know down in the comments below, because yeah, this is just generally a pretty tricky topic that I'm sure plenty of people will continue to argue about for years and years, and will probably do so in this very comment section. But for now, let's just focus on these mechanics specifically, because for now, we arrive at the title of this video. Recently, Nightreign came out as the latest game from FromSoft itself, of course, and it plays extremely differently from how most Souls games typically feel. It's way more fast-paced, with the characters able to sprint comically fast compared to most Souls protagonists, and it incorporates a ton of roguelike elements with how you level up and cycle through new gear that is lost at the end of each run, regardless of whether you win or lose. So, is Nightreign still a Souls-like, or has it deviated too much from the formula to still fall within that category? Well, like I said, I'm willing to be pretty open-minded for what counts as a Souls-like. I know many people might disqualify it immediately just on the grounds of its speed alone, or the fact that it's much more multiplayer-focused, but I'm not necessarily so hasty. I mean, like I said, I think that the actual design of the combat in a Souls game can be extremely varied while still feeling like a Souls game in general. And I mean, let's be real, Souls games have incorporated multiplayer elements all the way far back as Demon Souls, and Nightreign can be played entirely solo if you really wanna, so I don't think that that should necessarily disqualify it either. So, if we look beyond the combat, we can check up on our two big mechanics that I highlighted earlier. After all, at least at first glance, the game does still have graces from Elden Ring, which was that game's form of bonfires, and when you die, you still drop all of your resources on the map, and you have to go pick them back up. But if we look at the specifics of how these mechanics are implemented a little bit more closely, things are quite a bit different from the norm. For one, you don't even sit at these bonfires anymore. Simply running past them is enough to replenish your resources now. But more importantly, they no longer respawn the nearby enemies anymore. They're not even safe zones at all. They purely exist as places to spend your souls to level up and replenish your flasks. So the way that you interact with them is just fundamentally different now. Hell, when you die, you don't even necessarily respawn at the most recent bonfire. You can just kind of respawn somewhere on the map and meet back up with your team. On top of that, even the corpse running mechanic works very different now. Yeah, you drop all your resources as usual and you need to go to pick them back up before you die again. That's all standard stuff, but you actually drop a level on top of that now when you die, so you are explicitly being made weaker with each death, and not getting back to your dropped souls thus has a lot more risk to it now. So that's the question. Are these mechanics now too different for Nightreign to be called a Souls-like anymore? Because I'll admit, I am starting to feel like the connecting threads are only getting thinner and thinner at this point. But okay, maybe we should try looking at this from a different approach. Let's stop thinking about this in terms of concrete and specific game mechanics and try to zoom out a little bit and think about what makes a Souls-like from a more philosophical sense. So if we're putting aside things like stamina meters and bonfires and whatnot, I feel like the philosophical core of most FromSoft games and their lookalikes is that they tend to be about putting the player up against challenging obstacles with the expectation that they're probably not going to clear them on their first try. But that's okay, because even though you might drop all of the resources that you're carrying in these sorts of games, the important thing is that you don't get any weaker for failing. At least if we put aside things like those curses that everyone hates that also thankfully don't tend to show up in these games anymore. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that even if you lose all of your resources from dying in a Souls game, the boss will still be there with the same stats, and you'll still be at the same level you were when you first encountered them. So to me, it always feels like the core experience of a Souls game is that you'll have this like impossibly high looking wall to climb, usually in the form of a difficult boss fight. And I always feel that even if I'm dying over and over, that I am slowly making progress and getting better as I fight that boss over and over. And there's usually nothing getting in the way of me just simply trying over and over again, at slowly learning the boss's moveset, mastering my own moveset, and eventually being able to take them down if I'm willing to try enough times. But in Nightreign, that philosophy to me feels, well, completely absent, if not totally reversed. For one, when you die out in the field, not only do you drop your runes that you're carrying, but as I mentioned, you lose an entire level, so you do explicitly get weaker every time you die, especially if you aren't able to then reclaim those runes. But on top of that, the boss that you're fighting and the other enemies in the area aren't reset to full health when you die either. So you can actually kind of take a very different approach and sort of brute force your way through a number of bosses in the game that you find out in the field, because if you get the boss down to half health and die, well, you could just kind of run back to them and then take out the other half of their health and still get all of the rewards. Not to mention that because the game has a time limit for each day, you can't just keep fighting the same enemies and bosses over and over until you figure them out. You pretty much need to beat them in only 1 or 2 attempts, or else you'll have wasted so much time that they just won't be accessible anymore. Not to mention that with every new run, the bosses are totally randomized, so you can't necessarily get that sense of repeated training until you achieve mastery against a specific foe, because you have to constantly be on your toes for all kinds of new bosses that could show up with every new run. The only boss that's consistent, of course, is the one that's at the end of each run. But again, this is still fundamentally different from how most Souls games handle bosses, because you only get one chance to fight them per run. And if you die to that final boss, well, you have to do an entire different run fighting multiple other bosses just to get one more chance at them, which could easily take you like, what, 30 to 40 minutes just to get there again. And that's assuming you can even make it that far in a single attempt and you don't end up dying on night 1 or 2. So I think that the conclusion that I've sort of come to here is that when you think about it, the Souls-like and roguelike genres are kind of opposites of one another, at least from a core design principles sense. The core philosophy of a roguelike is that the player is constantly being put in new situations and is forced to adapt to new environments on the fly. You might only get one chance to fight a specific enemy or use a specific weapon when you encounter it, and once that run is over, you'll be forced to use new randomized weapons and abilities to fight new randomized enemies and bosses, and you have no idea how long it'll be again until you can find that weapon you liked or fight that one boss again. Meanwhile, Souls-likes are typically about having a consistent set of abilities and scenarios. Once you have your build, that's your build, and once you find a tough enemy, you can just keep fighting them over and over and over until you figure them out. The game isn't going to suddenly swap out the boss on your 4th attempt or something like that. So one genre is about mastering a more generalized skill set that is more adaptable to a wide variety of abilities and scenarios, while the other genre focuses on learning specific skills to overcome specific scenarios. So I think that, in a sense, by turning Elden Ring into a form of roguelike, they've essentially turned the Souls formula on its head, and well, kind of ended up making the opposite of a Souls game, in a sense at least. Now, I do think it is worth saying here at the end that I'm not pointing this out to like dunk on Nightreign or somehow try to invalidate it as a game or anything like that. I love the game and I love roguelikes as a whole. I'm not trying to say that it is somehow lesser for abandoning the Souls formula in favor of something different, but I do think that this means that at its core, ultimately, Nightreign is just fundamentally a different game from what I think most people would call a Souls-like. Or conversely, if you do still think of Nightreign as a Souls-like, then I feel that the term Souls-like itself will have functionally lost what little meaning it may have once had as a name for a genre, since it would be able to describe two very diametrically opposed styles of game design. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. So, do you agree with my analysis about how roguelikes and souls-likes seem functionally opposite to one another? Or do you maybe have a different or more robust definition of what you think a souls-like is that you think Nightreign can still slot into? By all means, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the matter. But as usual, if you liked the video, feel free to give me a like, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe. If you want to help support the channel more directly, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below. As always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.